Thank you for coming today to mark this historic occasion. 100 years yesterday, a meeting was held where Mary MacArthur addressed and announced that 800 women chainmakers from Cradley Heath, after a 10-week-long strike, had actually defeated their bosses and had won a minimum wage for the first time in Britain. Truly an historic occasion and a strike that took place at the start of truly historic events. It took place in 1910, just before a period known as the Great Unrest, a period that saw an enormous number of strikes develop across Britain, really in response to the great social divisions that had developed between the rich and the poor in Britain at that time. Some of those great divisions have been brilliantly talked about in Luke Perry's Titanic programme, if anyone has seen it. And that pressure meant people were angry at the situation they faced at work, and a lot of these strikes actually ended in victory, ended in people improving their conditions, improving their pay. So much so that the trade union movement in a space of 4 years doubled from 2 million members to 4 million members. But to fully appreciate the significance of the victory, I think it's worth just remembering some of the social conditions that working people had to endure back in 1910. Because this is a time before everybody had the vote. No women could vote. 40% of the poorest men could not vote. More importantly, politicians of the era in Parliament thought that women were not worthy of the vote, and that reflected a general attitude. So this is a time where there's no maternity rights, childcare is exclusive to the rich, and if anyone sees any pictures of Cradley Heath at that time, you'll see not only children playing alongside people working in the chain shops, but also babies stuck up the cots up corners, and literally women would give birth and take their baby to work with them the following day. Illiteracy was still common. Most of the women couldn't read or write at the time, and more shockingly, the accepted dominant view was that women should get paid less than men, even if they did exactly the same work. But alongside all the misery and poverty created by early industrialisation, it also created huge wealth and profits. This is when Britain was the workshop of the world. 90% of all chain produced in Britain was produced in Cradley Heath. And just to give you an idea of how poor the wages were, I'm just going to recall a few facts and figures about the kind of wages that were around at the time. A survey in 1904 of 2,000 working class households revealed that where households had less than 25 shillings a week, they spent 2/3 of their money buying cheap basic food. You take rent and materials and work out of that, there's nothing left really. In 1913, another study said round about £1 a week, concluded that there was 2 million men, 8 million people in all who existed under 25 shillings a week. And to quote the author, she said, "The great bulk of this enormous mass of people are underfed, underhoused and insufficiently clothed. Their growth is stunted, their mental powers are cramped, their health is undermined." The average male pay at the time was 26 shillings a week. That's just over £1 a week. The average wage for women in the country was 11 shillings a week. The chainmakers in Cradley, the women chainmakers, earned, before the strike, 5 to 6 shillings a week. That's a fifth of the average male pay. But it was absolutely a vital 5 to 6 shillings, because it needed to supplement the low wages the men had, because the men had 15 shillings a week. And if you look at the studies I've just talked about, you needed 20 shillings a week just for a very basic existence really. And it wasn't just the poverty wages that was a feature of the area. sure most people in the room are aware of the industry and the destruction to the environment that industrialisation made to the area. You literally have hundreds of chimneys in backyards across the area, all producing smoke. You'd have the smoke from the mines as well. There were no public facilities in the area. In fact, the two that existed at the time were the workhouse and the mortuary, which says a lot about the area. And not surprisingly, given those circumstances, many social commentators describe Cradley Heath as hell. Now initially, the social conditions that existed in Cradley Heath, and across many areas of the Black Country as well, were denied by the Conservative politicians at the time and the Chainmakers. They refused to acknowledge just how bad it was. And when the film got showed that they're in Carver organised about the disputes and the plight of the chain workers, when they was forced to recognise it, they then turned round and blamed drunkenness, people's drunkenness, for the problems that existed. They refused to acknowledge it was the fact that there was paying such low wages that was the issue. So these low wages didn't just happen by accident. It was a deliberate stance by the chain bosses and the employers that created those poverty wages. They had a system whereby the factories commissioned out pieces of work to people in the backyards on an individual basis. And they did this via middlemen. So the middlemen would literally go around to the chain shops each week, basically saying, you can have this piece of work, but you're prepared to do it for this price. Now, because the women were aware that if they refused, they could literally turn around the corner and go to another workshop and get the work done. The women weren't in a position to negotiate the appalling wages that were offered by the middlemen. And this system had developed over a number of years and had proved very profitable for the bosses. But in 1910, circumstances developed, which is why we're here today, that the women themselves realised their collective strength and the power of united action. After a national campaign in 1906 called the Anti-Sweating League, which was against low wages, the then Liberal government finally introduced some legislation for 4 industries that said these industries should be minimum rates of pay established. Domestic chain making was one of them. Also by then, the National Federation of Women Workers, which Mary McArthur led, had already recruited some 400 women in the area into the union. Now early on, the chain bosses pretended that they welcomed the legislation. But 3 months after negotiations, they'd still failed to agree a new rate. It was only when government officials pressed them to actually name what rate there should be that it got announced that it should be 11 shillings 3d a week, which was in effect a doubling of the wages that the women worked for. The new rate was due to come into effect in August, and this minimum rate had been settled, what it should be, late on in March. But between that time, the chain bosses and the middlemen organised to actually undermine that rate. They did 2 things. First of all, they decided to stockpile chain, so they went around commissioning more and more work, with the view that when the minimum rate came into effect, they would then stop commissioning work, use the stockpile up, and therefore hopefully persuade the women that if they want that it was the minimum wage that was going to put them out.